All right, well, I'm Lai Leong with the Center for Presidential History with my colleague Greta Swain. Today is October 28th. We're in New York City. This is the Oral History Project about Professor Walter LaFeber. Could we please start with you introducing yourself, please?
My name is Stewart. I was a student of Walt's between 1971 and 1974. I wrote my honors thesis with him and defended my honors thesis in front of him. And literally have been a lifelong friend of Walt's from 1971 until his unfortunate passing 50 years later.
Well, that's a lot of personal history to cover. Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll start from the beginning then. What were your first impressions of him?
So I was incredibly lucky. In my second semester freshman year at Cornell, I had Professor LaFeber for my small writing seminar. So I was literally one of 10 people interacting with Professor LaFeber on a weekly basis, with him grading my papers on a weekly basis. At that point, I really didn't know he was Walter LaFeber as I would come to know him and as we would be celebrating him with this event today. So it was an amazing experience to be in a room with this towering figure that I didn't know how towering he was, but to be introduced to this very gentle pedagogy with great humility combined with incredible breadth of knowledge and just the sheer generosity of spirit that here I am, a freshman nobody, and he's taking time to actually read what I've written and give it very considerable thought and feedback on a weekly basis. So that was my first introduction to Walt, and it was so amazing. I then proceeded to take every single possible Walt LaFeber course the rest of my Cornell life, undergraduate life, including a course that he and I made up my last semester while I was finishing up my honors thesis. It was a tutorial that we had where we jointly selected books of American history that had to be read. And so that was my last formal course with Walt, which was just sitting in a room with him talking about various interesting books that we both selected as the curriculum.
Just a second ago, before we started the camera rolling, you were telling me how the Beacon Theater lecture that he gave, his last public lecture, didn't quite capture, so Walt in his element maybe. Could you tell us a little bit more about what he was like in the classroom?
Yeah, so let me contrast it with the Beacon thing, which I think he was so overwhelmed by the occasion, it being his, quote, last lecture, which I think is a pretty daunting thing for anybody, because it's signaling the end of something very significant. But then to have that many people and have it such a big Cecil B. DeMille production, if you will, that really was not Walt LaFeber's style at all. So he was much more, I would say, stilted and not quite as animated. I mean, toward the very end, when he got into the actual history part of the presentation, that's more like what Walt was like in the classroom. What Walt was really like in the classroom, and I'm sure other people have talked about this with you, is you're in a fairly large room, packed to the gills, and he has written a couple of words on a blackboard, usually with Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3, which don't really help you when you're reviewing your notes, because unless you filled in the blanks, those 3 categories don't really help you understand too much what's going on. But in any event, in the course of 50 minutes, he gives you this amazing discourse that's seemingly seamless. I mean, how do you actually do this? Now that I'm teaching, and I've taught for 26 years myself as a sidelight to my law profession, I have a better sense of what that means and how difficult, and I can sort of approach that, but it's incredibly difficult, especially given the topics that he was talking about. But the sheer ease and making it seem so simple when it was not simple at all, and the bringing together the breadth of the information that he was providing us, and again, a very 50 minutes when you're a sophomore, it seems like a lot of time, but for real adults, that's really nothing. So his ability to do that every day, 3 days a week after week, was an extraordinary gift. And again, I'm sure you've heard this from other people, it was quite common that this was met with a standing ovation at the end of this, which is really quite unusual for anybody. I don't care how famous you are.
You spent 4 years with him as an undergrad, and then you went on to law school. Did he give you any advice about that, about going to law school and what you might make of yourself?
He was very helpful, actually. Although he never said you should go and do something else, because I'm a fourth generation lawyer in my family. He sort of knew that was in the cards. But he was very encouraging and thought that this would be a good fit for me, particularly at the Cornell Law School, where he knew a lot of the professors. But he also knew that there was going to be a big break, especially in that first year and a half, because law school, like a lot of graduate school experiences, is very, shall we say, monk-like. You have to spend 24/7, 365 a year concentrating solely on that job. So we weren't really in constant or even close contact while I was in law school. It was really, he always liked to joke that when I finished my law school, my last year, he and Sandy were going, I can't remember where they're going, but I was still in Ithaca studying for the bar exam, and he asked me to house sit for them for a weekend with their dog. And he always kidded me for the next 47 years, or 45 years, that he never forgot what a favor I did for him while I was studying for the bar, house sitting for he and Sandy and the dog.
So he kept up with you even while you were at law school,
yes.
Even after you graduated?
Yes, and then when I went to New York City, even though I was a young associate at a very prominent law firm, he and I kept up a lot of correspondence and contact, and he was very good about keeping me current, not just with what he was doing, but with the subject matter that he was interested, or subject matters he was interested in. So it was very stimulating for me to stay in touch with all the lines of scholarly inquiry that he'd introduced me to, and that he was continuing on with. And he was very interested in my opinion and whatever feedback I had, so it was very gratifying.
I'm really interested to hear that, because you don't hear that much anymore about how professors necessarily continue to keep in touch, especially in such close touch with their students.
Yeah, I think it was a true two-way street. I think because he knew I was so interested in it, it was genuine, that he was interested in having the dialogue come back to him. But it is very unusual. I had that experience with another Cornell professor, Joel Silby, who I also worked with as an undergraduate and was lifelong friends with as well. But Walt's interest was different. I mean, and that's one of the things I've always talked about. I published an article about Walt after he died. He was such a generous person. For someone of his towering intellect and accomplishments, he was genuinely interested in what you had to say, what you had to think. He, notwithstanding how smart he was and accomplished how he was different insofar as he never assumed that he was always right. He was always open to hearing what other people had to think. If they had some interesting thoughts, some evidence that was contrary to what he believed, he was interested in hearing that, and maybe he could learn from that and change or amend his view. And one of the things over the scope of his scholarship, the amazing breadth of his scholarship, he did change things based upon things that he heard or people who criticized him, and if he thought there's some merit to it, he went and looked at it, and he wasn't so I'm always right type of person. He was able to amend some things, and he did, which is a token of a great man, great person.
Were there specific topics that he'd like to discuss with you?
We spanned a lot of different topics. So he was very interested in my law career, and so we would talk about that. He had a little competition with Professor Silby over Professor Silby's specialty was American political history, especially in the middle part of the 19th century. So part of that spanned Walt's interest. So there was a little competition between, well, what are you doing with Silby and what are you doing with me, sort of thing. One area that we shared a lot of interest in was William Henry Seward, who was a big hero of both of ours. And so I'll tell you two stories about that. One is I published a lot of stuff in my professional life, about 300 plus articles. And a lot of them are historical in nature, and some of them dealt directly with Mr. Stewart. And Walt, after he saw one of these, he wrote me a 3-page, single-spaced letter about how much he appreciated that, how good he thought it was, and how he was going to use it at some point in the future. Well, at that point, he was a pretty senior faculty member. I was wondering, well, how are you going to use this? And in his inaugural address as the president of the what's called Schaefer, which is the group of diplomatic historians, he actually cited my article in his presidential address. And when I saw this, I was literally dumbfounded. I just couldn't believe it. And next time I saw him in Ithaca, I said, gee, that was so gracious of you. Thank you so much. I didn't know what to say. I was sort of stumbling over my words. And Walt said, why are you thanking me? You did the work. And that's such a typical Walt LaFeber comment. I can hear him saying that to not just me, but scores of other LaFeber students who've gone on to do things, who've done the work, and he's just acknowledging that. So that's a real LaFeberism. The other LaFeber story about Seward is he and I got into a pattern. I'm very active for Cornell. I've been on the board of trustees and other things. And so on virtually every trip to Cornell, I would spend one night away from Cornell stuff, go to his house for a glass of wine, and then we'd go to his favorite restaurant for dinner. And it was a great opportunity to catch up with him and Sandy. And on one occasion, we had some extra I had some extra time that weekend, not in meetings. So I said, Walt, why don't we go to the Seward House, which is up in Auburn, New York, which is a beautiful museum. And he said, that'd be great. He said, I haven't been there in years. So we went, and of course, here are two people who know more about William Henry Seward than probably anyone else in the country. And so we're taking the tour of the Seward House, and the guide is pointing this out, and we're saying, well, no, that's not quite right. And the professor said, no, that's not the way it happened. And so the guide, by the time we were finished, just really didn't like us a whole lot. But it was sort of a funny experience with us walking through the Seward Museum, constantly correcting the so-called expert. But so those were two Seward experiences I had with Walt. But Seward is one of the most consequential Americans in history, and Walt's original book, The New Empire, is based a lot about what Seward not only did, but his intellectual construct for the expansion of America.
You talk about your own quite prolific writing. To what extent would you say your preparation as a student of history as an undergrad and working with Professor LaFeber in particular prepared you for your legal career?
Not so much for my legal career, but where I thought you were going with your question, with my writing career, especially in history, an enormous, I can't even calculate what the impact of that is. So I've just published a book about Myron Taylor, who's a very famous man no one's ever heard of. And my whole approach to writing that book is so informed by the lessons I learned those 4 years with Professor LaFeber and Professor Sylvie. And just to give you one example, one of the most important lessons they gave me was that history cannot be constructed with the benefit of hindsight. You have to write history based upon what people knew at the time. So, for example, people in the 1850s did not know there was going to be a civil war. They did not know that the North would win a civil war. So writing a history about the 1850s based upon that you know that there's going to be a civil war, that's ridiculous because no one knew that in 1858. That was very important in my writing this book about Myron Taylor, because he's at the epicenter of the most important geopolitical issues of World War II, when no one knew who was going to win that war. So writing about those events was really informed by that approach to history that I learned as an undergraduate.
Did you consult him in the writing of this book?
I did, and he was very gracious with respect to several of the early chapter drafts in giving me very voluminous feedback, which was, again, incredibly generous of him. It's astonishing. I still have this as a keepsake. He's incredibly generous, an amazingly busy person, to take on this very early draft and give me that sort of feedback. So he was very interested in it. Unfortunately, the book came out after he passed. It's dedicated to him because he inspired my lifelong interest and love of history.
That's remarkable. I wonder if I could ask you some questions in relation to your role as Cornell trustee, because Professor LaFeber, of course, loomed large in Cornell as an institution as well. Could you tell us about some interactions you had with him as Cornell trustee?
Well, I'd go back and give you even some more interesting flavor, if you will,
Sure.
Because Walt's importance to Cornell is not just as a prodigious scholar and a transformative teacher for 50 years of students or 47 years of students. He was one of the people who helped save Cornell in 1969. But another person who helped save Cornell in 1969 was my father, who was also a Cornell trustee. He was chairman of the executive committee of the board of trustees. And he was one of the people who made sure Cornell survived so that Walt stayed at Cornell. My father's one of the people who transitioned the president, one president to the next president, and that transition is what convinced Walt to stay at Cornell. So that's a much more significant than interaction with Walt and Walt's history at Cornell, my father's own role. My interactions with him as a trustee, he was basically not retired, but he did not have the same direct interaction with the life of the campus as he did in '69, for example. He was much more of a senior status icon, if you will, and not as interested in the inner politics of Cornell. That being said, in that time period, Walt was unfailingly generous to giving of his time to Cornell events, which were of nature to be not so much promoting Walt per se, but promoting Cornell to various alumni groups and others. And I thought, again, I'd just say it was exceedingly generous by a very generous person who was trying to help Cornell. But by the time I was on the board, Walt was not as keyed into Now, that being said, before I went on the board, Walt, of course, was very upset with the Latino takeover of the Strait. I was chair of the university council at that point, but that role did not put me in as a fiduciary of the university. So I didn't have a direct role when Walt was very unhappy about that. That all worked out, but by the end of that decade, in the early decade of the 2000s, Walt was a little bit pulled back from the inner workings of the university, I would say.
In that case, may I ask you a little bit more about the events of 1969?
Mm-hmm.
I had not known about your father's role. Tell us more. Professor LaFeber's feelings about those events have been written about a little bit.
Yes.
But I wonder if you had a ringside seat, so to speak. Could you talk a bit more about the interactions between your father and Professor LaFeber, or what Professor LaFeber did or felt about those events?
Well, it's very difficult because my father was close to a lot of the individuals in that. So President Perkins was a good friend of his. Clinton Roster was a good friend of his. I actually went to school with Clinton Roster's son. And the university was literally being torn apart, and it really didn't know how to deal with it. Was not just a generational issue, it was a split between people who were trying to do the right thing, President Perkins, and that was butting up against this problem about keeping the academy free from violence, keep it open to opposing viewpoints. And those points, Walt was just, there was no nuanced view there. His view of that was, this cannot stand, this just cannot be allowed to happen. And my father was very supportive of President Perkins' outreach to make Cornell more accessible to minorities, particularly Black Americans. Very, very, very supportive of that. And no one really knew how this experiment was going to work out when it started in the mid-'60s. And unfortunately, when 68 turned to 69, it turned out very, very badly, which no one was accusing President Perkins of bad faith. He was a man of very good faith and good intentions. It just all worked out horribly, and he had to go, and that was it. So my father's one of the senior people on the board that made sure this transition happened, and the university had to survive this and move on to the next step. And years later, I took my dad over to visit with Walt, and first thing Walt said was, "Well, it's nice to be here with a living legend." And my father was an extremely modest person, and he sort of, as was Walt, he sort of waved that away. But it's true. I mean, my father devoted his adult years to lead Cornell.
And Professor LaFeber was on the verge of leaving Cornell?
He was driving to University of Maryland to take a position there when he heard that Dale Corson had been picked to succeed Perkins. And he had such confidence in Dale, as did my dad, that he turned the car around and came back to Cornell. So he was that close to leaving.
I'm not familiar with the other set of events that you mentioned, the Latino takeover. Could you tell us? I haven't come across that in my readings. Could you say more about that?
Well, it's not as famous because there were no guns involved, happily, and no one was saying Cornell will die at 8 o'clock tonight, sort of rhetoric. But there was a very significant event in, I believe it was 94, where Latino students took over Day Hall. And it was peaceful, but this was something that hadn't happened at Cornell since the late 60s, early 70s. So that had a sort of a time lapse. Like, we haven't seen this in a while. We used to have this all the time, but students taking over buildings is sort of new and different. So this took a while to sort of figure out how to deal with this, because it was confrontational, and it was, we demand this, and we're not going to leave this building until these demands are met. And having gone through this experience, existential experience, 15 years before, 16 years before, it wasn't, let's repeat this because that didn't work out so well, and we don't want to do this again. So the university dealt with it in a much more, I'll say, nuanced way, but it wasn't as existentially a confrontation as you didn't have rifles and bandoleros and things like that. But it was a serious event at the time, and Walt was very upset about it because it was inconsistent with what he thought the university was about. You don't affect change by taking over buildings and making demands and stuff like that. There are other ways to handle that, and the students didn't agree with that. So, but that's, I shouldn't say, that was his very strongly held view about what higher education had to be about. There had to be a place where you didn't have these types of confrontations that involved a physical element. There had to be a place where free speech was paramount and people had the ability to disagree.
Do you know what views he held about bringing in more underrepresented students and the like?
Oh, he's completely supportive of that. No, I mean, if anything, Walt was the ultimate believer in meritocracy. I mean, the people who succeeded as undergraduates with him, the people who succeeded as graduate students, the people who are here for this event, represent a pretty broad spectrum of backgrounds, which in my mind, and I don't want to speak for Walt, I think he would agree with this, but I never asked him this because it seems so self-evident. I think one of the reasons he stayed at Cornell is one of the same reasons I loved Cornell, which is because there were so many different types of people here. It was not homogenous. There were people here who got ahead because they worked hard. And there were people who didn't get ahead because they didn't want to work hard. Okay, that was their choice. But the people who worked hard, they didn't all look the same. They weren't all from the same backgrounds. There were people who were rewarded just because they worked hard. And to Walt, that was the gold standard. Were you interested in this? Were you committed to doing this? Did you do, in my story about the Stewart article, you did the work. Why are you congratulating me? You did the work. I'm sure he said that to people of every different kind of background you can imagine, because he inspired so many people to do the work. And it wasn't just people who were from a socio-economic background of X. It was these people who met him, saw him in the classroom, were inspired by him, and wanted to not be like him because he's sui generis, but wanted to impress him, wanted to show him, I can do the work. And so they did the work, and he said, you did the work. So.
When you were a student, were you among those who were invited to his home?
Oh yes, quite frequently.
What was that like?
It was different. It was different. It's, again, one of the things you don't expect from a university like Cornell. It was, that was something that was an experience I had when I was in boarding school. That was not the norm anyone else at Cornell. No one else did that, to my knowledge. And it was different. I mean, it seemed a little odd to me because it seemed more like prep school to me. It didn't seem like the big university experience. I mean, it was lovely and it was pleasant. It was lovely to meet Sandy and get to know them in a different setting. But it seemed a little unusual to me because my whole other life at Cornell as an undergraduate was you're thrown into the deep end of the pool and let's see how you swim. And some people swam better than others, and some people sank to the bottom, and some people got out of the pool and reacted differently, right? But that sort of warm and fuzzy experience, that was unique to that. That's not the way Cornell, at least when I was an undergraduate. The rest of it was very unfuzzy, unwarm, very competitive. It was an undergraduate experience for A-type personalities who had a desired goal, and they were going to achieve that goal, whatever it took. And those are the people who succeeded at Cornell, inside Walt's course or outside Walt's course. So it was lovely, I enjoyed it, it was fun, but it was different, and it was unique. It felt very different than the rest of my Cornell experience.
But was it just a simple matter of moving the classroom into his home, or did you talk about different things when you were in his home?
It was both, because you were experiencing the LaFeber family. So you're talking about his children, how they're doing. Sandy's love of gardening. It developed it over time. Every time I came to the LaFeber house, I would bring some plant for Sandy's garden. So one of the sad things is when Sandy moved from Ithaca after Walt's passing, all these plants that were in their garden were left behind for the next owner, which was sort of sad from my perspective, and also from Sandy's. So there was this nice feeling of being in the house and, again, being exposed to the family. And there was also the element of the class. But it's a very different experience than being in a seminar room with Walt, trying to justify your position for this or explain why what you put in footnote 14 withstands scrutiny. That's a sort of different thing a little bit. And I think that's part of what he was trying to do, was trying to take a little bit of that pedagogical edge off this. So we can take ourselves very seriously here. Let's try to take ourselves a little less seriously here and recognize it's not all hard charging all the time. There's a nicer element to the experience as well, which again, I think everyone appreciated. But for those hard charging type A personalities, they were still focused on the end game, as was I.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say, looking back, as a whole, what did Professor Walter LaFeber mean to you?
So the answer is several things. And so let me give you the context of this. When I found out that Walt was dying, I endowed a scholarship. It's not really a scholarship, it's a fund it's actually in his name and my name, for the history department. And he sent me his last email before he died, just a couple days before he died, thanking me and how appreciative he was of this. And every time I look at that email, it's a very emotional email, because I knew what happened just a couple days after that. But when I publicly endowed this, I talked about some of the characteristics of the man. So let me I think that's the answer that I would give. First is, he undoubtedly was employed the most gentle pedagogy of anyone I've ever studied with. And here is this brilliant man who is so gentle. I mean, you contrast that with the Socratic dialogue that's used in law school. That's not gentle, trust me, because I use it as a law professor myself. It's not gentle. But his gentle pedagogy from someone as incredibly accomplished and wonderful as Walt really stands out as number one. The second thing about him that's very unique is his humility. For someone of his accomplishments, not just as a scholar, but as a teacher, not just in the classroom, but as you alluded to, for years after, you're still teaching. That lack of ego is astonishing. I mean, here you have this world famous, at the very peak of his profession, who has no ego, a very humble person. That's a very astonishing and unique characteristic of Walt. The third thing about him, again, very unique for someone in his position and of his accomplishments, is he was always open to new ideas. He didn't always believe that he was right. Now, most world famous scholars have a predisposition, I'm always right and you're wrong, let's move on to the next subject. That was not Walt LaFeber at all. If you presented him with new evidence or have you considered this point of view, he would say, gee, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Let's look at that and maybe I'll change my mind about that. Now here, this is Walt LaFeber saying, somebody like me saying, Walt, have you considered this? And I'm saying, gee, that's interesting. Let me think about that. What evidence do you have? And he would change his mind on occasion. That's astonishing. That's really astonishing. But that's who Walt LaFeber was. And then the last thing I'd say about him, which these are all sort of related, he's the most generous person I've ever met in academia. Or in my professional life, there's only one other person who's another mentor of mine in the law profession, who comes close to being as generous in sharing himself, his talents, his knowledge, his person with not just me. It's not a story about me. All the people downstairs, all the people who've come to this event, all of his graduate students, he shared himself with all of us. And it's like, people generally don't do that. And it's not just sharing himself in the classroom, going over an honors thesis or a PhD thesis. It's sharing himself over the course of his life. Again, he was my friend for 50 years. That gift of generosity is an astonishing thing, which, and they're all sort of related, those 4 points, but it's hard to think of an international superstar professor who's changed the life of 50 years, 47 years of students' lives. Every one of those people will tell you, yes, he was the most generous professor that they've ever had. So those 4 elements, I think, sort of, in my view, sort of sum up my own perspective of Walt and what he meant, not just to me, but I think to a whole multiple generations of Cornellians.
Well, I only know him through his textbook.
It's a great textbook.
It is a great textbook. One more question that you happen to have mentioned, sparked by what you just said. Can you remember an instance when he did change his mind and what that might have been about?
Oh, sure. So a historian named Lewis Gould attacked one of Walt's footnotes in his first book. And Walt went back and sort of reluctantly admitted that he probably could have written it a little different. That's one example. Another example, also with the same book, is the status of the business community in New York before the Spanish-American War, and how much they were pressuring McKinley to initiate a war with Spain versus whether they had to be persuaded. Initially, his view was that the business community in New York, Wall Street, was an active pusher of this. And I think over time, he was persuaded to modify that at least initially, they were not so interested in going to war, but later came around to supporting the idea of war. So that's the sort of thing I mentioned before. He was open to criticism. He was open to new ideas. He didn't always think he was right, and he was willing to modify views that he expressed over time, based with new information, which, in my mind, is the quintessential element of a real scholar, because the opposite of that is a closed mind. So he was the quintessential scholar in my mind because he had an open mind to consider new evidence. And of course, in history, you're always presented with new evidence. It's not a static, because if we're always looking at history with the same parameters, then nothing's going to change. People are always bringing new perspectives and new evidence. And we've talked about this with the panels today. Walt evolved as the profession evolved. And you can say in certain points he did better in that evolution, and some maybe he lagged behind a bit because he was a human being. But that's the nature of evolution, that you do change or you don't change depending on your ability to adapt to change. But he was very adaptable because he kept an open mind.
Was there anything else you might want to add that my prompts did not elicit?
One thing I would tell you about how generous he was and how he always kept open this, what I call a two-way street between people who'd been his students 20, 30, 40 years before. So twice in my professional career, I achieved some notable things. One was with respect to a trial, which I won, which had been on the front page of the New York Times for several weeks. And another when the New York State Bar Association gave me a very prestigious award for contributions to the field of legal ethics. And on both occasions, completely out of the blue, a bottle of champagne arrived at my house from Walt. And like, who does that, right? And needless to say, both of those champagne bottles have not been touched, and probably never will be. But I was touched that completely out of the blue. I still don't know how he found out about the New York State Bar Award, but reading the New York Times as he did, I knew about the trial. But I mean, who does that, right? And that's Walt. That's Walt. So the other thing I will say is when I found out he was ill, and then I found out how serious it was, I sent flowers every week to his house. And the very sad day, his daughter Suzanne sent me an email saying, "Your flowers just arrived. Unfortunately, I have to tell you this was the day that my father passed away." So that was a pretty tough exchange that day as well. But I really wanted to have some brightness and levity in his house for his last days, and I hope that helped a little bit.
Well, thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you.